Welcome everyone to History Gone Wilder, part of Half History Will Travel. I'm your host, Wilder historian Dr. Lucas Wilder, and the Patreon members chose William S. Rosecrans to be the next Union general covered in a biography series. Most people know him as the victor at Stones River and the commander who ran away at Chickamauga, but I hope that at the end of this series that you'll come away with a more holistic understanding of Rosecrans and his pre- and post-war life. If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already. Join the Patreon page or purchase something from the Teespring store or Etsy shop. Every little bit helps. Thank you. William Stark Rosecrans sat in his family home in Yellow Springs, Ohio on December 30th, 1864, writing to his good friend and former Chief of Staff James A. Garfield. He asked Garfield a question. He would write, "I, who began by drill and home guards of Cincinnati, teaching the 1st Ohio troops how to encamp at Denison, who fought the first successful campaign against Lee, helped to lay the foundations of the first free state made out of a slave state, receiving for my service a unanimous vote of thanks from the legislature, who invented and had built the first army ambulance now universally used, who first suggested and put into operation the plan of providing photographed information maps of the country for distribution among military commanders, now regarded as almost indispensable in all the great military operations in which there are not good topographical maps, whose Inspector General system has been adopted throughout the Army, who built up the cavalry in Mississippi, giving Sheridan the opportunity of winning his first star, who won at Iuka and Corinth against great odds, who built up the dispirited mounted force of Buell's army and brought it to be the victorious cavalry of the Army of the Cumberland, who fought Stones River, drove Bragg from Shelbyville, Tullahoma, and Chattanooga, wresting from a superior force the keys of East Tennessee, Georgia, and the center of the Southern Confederacy, who struck the Ohio and other Copperheads a great blow, virtually killed the Order of American Knights, drove Price from Missouri, and did much to give that state freedom. An officer of sobriety, morality, industry, abstinence from all intrigues military and political, I find myself put into retirement in apparent disgrace, while young men of less age, rank, services, men tainted with pecuniary speculation, if not peculation, are in command and favor. I want to tax your friendship, in which I confide, to find out and give me an explanation of how and why this is." As one of Rosecrans's biographers stated, Rosecrans's history was written by his enemies, and the stereotype, which to this day passes for Rosecrans' portrait, was created chiefly by Ulysses S. Grant, reporters, Second Assistant Secretary of War Dana, and their friends, a portrait frequently copied but seldom examined. It is a popular image distorted with error, an unfriendly caricature. What manner of man was this who won the unqualified lifelong esteem and love of the admirable and forthright George H. Thomas, and the violent dislike of the generally moderate and reserved Ulysses S. Grant? Who was worshipped as few generals are worshipped by the men whom he commanded, and hated by the Secretary of War? His life story gropes toward an answer. He was a true son of the lusty pioneer breed that begat him. He was a Rosecrans, a mover. In 1808, Dr. Daniel Rosecrans moved through the wilderness of eastern Pennsylvania and into central Ohio, hoping to take advantage of the plentiful land for cheap. His ancestors were a mix of Dutch and Norwegian heritage, and came to New Amsterdam, later to be known as New York, in the 1600s. Daniel's father served in the American Revolution, as well as many of his kinfolk. Daniel's side of the family changed the spelling of their name from Rosecrans to Rosecrans to keep them from being mistaken for Hessians. He and his wife, Thankful Rosecrans, had 10 children in all, and the eldest was named Crandall, who was born in 1794. Not only was the Rosecrans family patriotic and prone to join the military, they were also religious. Thankful Rosecrans was a devout Methodist, and Daniel was a Universalist. Crandall never affiliated with any particular church, but was said to be a man of religious feeling and a stern moral code. Following in the military tradition of the Rosecrans family, Crandall enlisted in the Light Horse Battalion and joined General William Henry Harrison's command in the War of 1812. He eventually became Harrison's adjutant and achieved the rank of captain. He would marry Jemima Hopkins, whose father served in the American Revolution, and was a relative of Governor Stephen Hopkins of Rhode Island, a signer of the Declaration of Independence. Their first child died in infancy. Their second child would be baptized into the Church of England as William Stark Rosecrans. The middle name, Stark, came from one of Crandall's heroes, Revolutionary War General John Stark, but Crandall added an E to the end of his son's middle name. William and his family moved to Homer, where his father opened a tavern and a store, and was contracted for construction projects of roads, bridges, and canals. The family lived well, not rich, but definitely comfortable. A copy of the Declaration of Independence hung in the home of the patriotic family, and William, only 5 years old, memorized it. Crandall would put William up on a barrel and have him recite it to crowds. The family also owned Frederick Butler's 3-volume History of the United States, which William read intently, becoming a lover of history, and particularly the Battle of New Orleans. His father taught him to say hurrah for Jackson. His deeply religious mother taught him to tell the truth in all situations. When he was no more than 5 years old, he accidentally killed a gander in his attempt to shoo it out of his mother's garden. She made the boy go to the owner with the gander in hand and explain what happened. Decades later, William would recall the terror he felt at having to confess his actions. The woman who owned the gander saw the boy's terror and comforted him with bread and jam after the confession. William and his brothers, with William as their leader, would roughhouse, play, and get into trouble like boys do, but William was very organized. He and his brothers and their friends would have sham battles with cornstalks, and they even formed a boys' military company, inspired by William's father being the captain of the Homer militia. William's motto in these sham battles was to lick and not get licked. William was also studious. Although it was a frontier education in a log schoolhouse, it gave William the basic understanding of math and reading skills that laid the foundation for him to teach himself. One of his favorite books was Thaddeus of Warsaw, and when he found that his copy had the last page torn out, he saved up enough money to buy a whole new copy just to read that last page. In his early teens, William began working as a clerk in his father's store, and he helped keep his account book. Eventually, he would go to work for another store, and when that store moved to Mansfield, Ohio, he went with it. At age 16, William traveled down the Ohio and Mississippi River and got sick in Vicksburg, Mississippi, then returned home to Mansfield. After a conversation with a lawyer who paid William to drive him in a wagon to Columbus, the lawyer said that the conversation was so intelligent that William should consider going further in school. The family didn't have enough money to send William to college, but there was an opportunity: the United States Military Academy at West Point. William traveled 50 miles to the office of Congressman Alexander Harper, looking for an appointment to West Point. Harper planned on sending his own son, but the interview went so well that he appointed William instead. William would take some classes at Kenyon College in the 3 months before he had to leave for New York to brush up on his academics, then left in June of 1838 for West Point, first going by coach to Cleveland, then by boat to Buffalo. Then he got on the Erie Canal to Albany. From Albany he traveled east by railroad, then finally by boat to West Point. He entered West Point with fellow classmates James Longstreet, John Pope, Earl Van Dorn, and Don Carlos Buell. Classmates ahead of him that he befriended were George Thomas and William T. Sherman. His classmates gave him the nickname Old Rosie, or just Rosie. Rosecrans did great in academics at West Point. As he rose up in the ranks at West Point, he came into contact with an underclassman named Ulysses S. Grant. One evening after taps, Rosecrans found Grant still in the yard. Grant explained that he was ordered to guard the pump until the next call sounded. Rosecrans said to him, "You go to bed at Tattoo, and douse your lights at taps." Grant shot back, "But how do I know that you're not playing a trick on me too?" Rosecrans responded, "See my chevrons? I'm officer of the day." That was the two's first encounter. In a quarrel over a lady with one of his classmates, Rosecrans was challenged to a duel. Since he was the one challenged, Rosecrans got to choose weapons. He chose pistols at 6 paces. The classmate apologized, and the duel was called off. At the end of his time at West Point, Rosecrans ranked 5th in his class in 1852, and the first Westerner to be named to the Engineer Corps. At graduation, he met Miss Anna Elizabeth Hegeman, a house guest of one of the professor's family. That evening, he took her on a walk to the local rendezvous point, and by the end of the night, he was in love with Annie. Rosecrans' first duty station was at Fort Monroe on the peninsula in Virginia. The whole time he tried to get a professorship at West Point. In 1843, he received a promotion to first lieutenant. By the summer of 1843, Rosecrans was given the professorship. In August, he married Annie at the St. Paul's Episcopal Chapel in New York City. At West Point, he worked in the engineering department under legendary Professor Dennis Hart Mahan. There, he served as post commissary and quartermaster, and oversaw the building of a new barracks for the cadets. When war with Mexico broke out, Rosecrans wasn't sent to the front lines. He was held back in the United States on other duties. In 1847, Rosecrans began a 5-year assignment as an engineer supervising the fortifications at Newport, Rhode Island. There, he designed a general system of permanent barracks and constructed a military wharf and completed the interior of the fortification. He even developed dredging machinery that was 8 times more efficient in making waterways deeper than the conventional method. He also came up with a better way to lay piers in the water. After his amazing success at Newport, the military sent him to Washington Naval Yard, where he became the civil and construction engineer of that location. In just 9 months, he constructed a marine railway, built a large sawmill, and remodeled and improved the Dahlgren Ordnance buildings. He drew up plans for the construction of an immense group of machine shops, combining anchor, chain, cable, blacksmith, carpenter, and block shops. Rosecrans and Annie thoroughly enjoyed their time in Washington. By this point, they had 4 children, recalling their stay in the capital as one of their favorite places. Rosecrans, while in the city, served as superintendent of a black Sunday school of 600 children. Annie made her home at the school and helped them meet expenses. Soon, the meager pay of a soldier wore on Rosecrans, and he wanted to increase his income. He applied to teach at the Virginia Military Institute in Lexington, Virginia, but future Confederate General Thomas Stonewall Jackson would get the job. In March 1853, Rosecrans resigned from the Army. For 2 years, he worked as an engineer and architect for hire. Then in June 1855, he worked for the Canal River Coal Company to assess the available resources in the mountains of western Virginia. The state of Virginia would support the creation of and be the 3/5 owner of the new Coal River Slackwater Navigation Company, and Rosecrans would be elected its president. He didn't remain in that position long. After a dispute over extravagant estimates for a coal oil refinery, he resigned and went into business with 2 partners to build a refinery with a capacity of 500 gallons per day on Columbia Street in Cincinnati, Ohio. It was one of the first of its kind west of the Appalachian Mountains. The American public wanted a colorless, illuminating oil that would not foul the wick, and during a test of an experimental product to meet that demand, a safety lamp exploded, burning Rosecrans severely, and setting fire to the refinery. He was able to beat out the flames and walk 1.5 miles home, but his recovery took 18 months, and the burns left a permanent smirk on his face. During his recovery, his partners nearly sunk the refinery because they weren't as good at managing as Rosecrans. When he returned to the refinery, he discovered a cheap process of manufacturing soap with chlorine properties, and invented a kerosene lamp that successfully burnt a round wick, and invented a short chimney lamp. When he got French and English patents on those inventions, he formed a company to manufacture them. All these innovations came about in 1860, a turbulent time as Abraham Lincoln, Stephen Douglas, John Bell, and John C. Breckinridge all vied for the presidency. Rosecrans voted for Douglas, but Lincoln won in the end, sending South Carolina into a secession convention and resulting in that state leaving the Union. Between December 1860 and April 1861, militia companies sprang up all over the North and the South anticipating civil war. Rosecrans became the head of the 14th Ward of Cincinnati's Home Guards, known as the Marion Rifles. When Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter on April 12, 1861, Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion. Rosecrans said he felt impelled by a strong sense of duty to offer his services to the United States. He left the refinery in the hands of his 2 partners and offered his services to the governor of Ohio, William Dennison. The governor was giving out commissions for major generals and chose George B. McClellan to be one of them within Ohio's armed forces, and he asked Rosecrans to be McClellan's aide. Rosecrans agreed. Old Rosie helped pick the site for the Ohio militia and chose a site 13 miles north of Cincinnati and named it Camp Dennison after their governor. When the men started to put floors and bunks into their huts, Rosecrans ordered them ripped out. Jacob D. Cox, another major general of Ohio's forces, asked, "Has McClellan forbidden floors?" Rosecrans responded, "No, sir, but my position as chief of engineers gives me sufficient control of the subject." The matter was brought to McClellan, and he sided with Cox. Dennison sent Rosecrans to Philadelphia and Washington to secure weapons, equipment, and uniforms for Ohio troops. While in Washington, Rosie petitioned the Secretary of War, Simon Cameron, and Winfield Scott, commander of all United States forces, for a commission as a brigadier general. As he was working toward achieving a higher rank in the upcoming war, Governor Dennison created the office of Chief Engineer of the state of Ohio and put Rosecrans at its head. Rosecrans wrote back, "It would be very gratifying to me to stay at home with my family, be at the state capitol with you, and enjoy the many opportunities for having a finger in fat contracts which would offer. But our people must go to the front with or without leaders, and fight and die for the country. I cannot stay at home and see this. Duty demands that I should offer my military acquirements to aid in diminishing the loss of life. I must go with our people to the front." Despite his objection to taking the position, Rosecrans accepted the office until his brigadier generalcy would be obtained. He would be named brigadier general to date from May 16, 1861. Soon after receiving his commission, he was given a brigade of 4 Ohio regiments and ordered into Western Virginia. The political state of Western Virginia became a great concern to governors, generals, and civilians, and they wanted relief for that predominantly Unionist area. By June 1st, McClellan gathered around 8,000 men at Parkersburg, Virginia, and the next day ordered them to attack a Confederate garrison south of their position. It was a brief fight, but Rosecrans and his new recruits got their first taste of battle and pressed on to the town of Buchanan and Rich Mountain, where a Confederate force was entrenched. Rosecrans conferred with McClellan about the best possible way to dispose of the Confederates and hatched a plan to swing to the south and outflank the rebel entrenchments. Before dawn on the morning of July 11th, Rosecrans and McClellan moved out. The signal for McClellan to attack would be the guns of Rosecrans's force. Every man was to keep quiet, and they did, but a horse of Rosecrans's adjutant began to neigh and snort, causing a great disturbance. Rosecrans, in a display of his hot temper, yelled, "Cut off his head, adjutant! Cut his head off!" Rosecrans prepared his men for the attack and let loose his columns upon the Confederate position. The volleys from the infantry echoed through the valleys and off the mountainsides, the signal for McClellan to move his troops forward, but he simply sat on his horse, listening to the din of battle. Despite McClellan's lack of aggression, Rosecrans pushed the Confederates off Rich Mountain and claimed the position for the Union. The Battle of Rich Mountain happened just before the Union defeat at First Bull Run, and the victory boosted McClellan's standing in the United States military, and he would soon go east and become the commander of the Army of the Potomac. A famous author of the time, John T. Trowbridge, wrote to Rosecrans the next year saying, "Do you remember once when I proposed to join my fortunes in this war to yours, your answer? I venture you don't. It was this: I shall connect my fortunes with McClellan's. I replied you had better join Mac's to yours. You answered, no, Mac is a lucky dog. And so you joined him, went into Western Virginia with him, fought Rich Mountain for him, and made him commander-in-chief. If, when you were outflanking Pegram, he had whipped you, whose defeat would it have been? Rosecrans. But as you whipped him, it was McClellan's victory." Rosecrans performed admirably at Rich Mountain. He conducted his troops efficiently and made sure the columns of blue soldiers traversed the rugged terrain of Western Virginia with the utmost care to themselves and to best outflank the enemy. In the end, it was Rosecrans's victory, even though McClellan got the lion's share of the praise. On July 23, 1861, Rosecrans took command of the Department of the Ohio, encompassing Western Virginia, Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, and Illinois, with its headquarters at Clarksburg, Virginia. His new enemy in Western Virginia would be Robert E. Lee, who now operated in the area. Their first contact was about a prisoner exchange. Rosecrans said, "You asked me for men captured here, hardy mountaineers, who would reinforce your army operating against me. You proposed to give me men captured at Bull Run, who know nothing of service here." In August, Rosecrans had more trouble out of his men than he had with the enemy. The undisciplined young men, many still teenagers, didn't adhere to military discipline as quickly as Rosecrans would have hoped. Rosie wanted a professional army, and would roam through the camps in person to inspect the men and their quarters. After taps, he would walk through camp and would whack the tents with his sword, which still had their lights on. Little by little, the small army under Rosecrans became more disciplined. Rosie wasn't always a strict disciplinarian. One day, when some troops were unloading freight from a boat, their captain let the men take off their jackets while they worked. As the men lay sprawled out on the ground resting, Rosecrans rode up and said to the captain, "Don't you know, sir, that it is against orders to allow men on duty to remove their equipment?" The captain responded, "The man that issued that order never did a day's work, and I'll see him in hell before I'll let my men swelter with their accoutrements on." Rosecrans rode silently to the boat. While out of earshot, the captain was informed who the man on horseback was. When Rosie rode back by the group, they were in full uniform and drilling. Rosecrans said, "A company that can handle muskets that well should be allowed to unload a steamer without anything on if they want to." Rosecrans regularly ate dinner with his subordinate officers and used crackers placed on the table to illustrate outpost and picket duty. Being one of the best well-trained officers in his army, he felt it was his duty to instruct them, although he wished he had help from other professionally trained officers. One soldier wrote, "Our general is an incessant worker. He is in his saddle almost constantly. He has not had a full night's sleep since he has been in Virginia, and he takes his meals as often on horseback as at his table." His soldiers recognized him as a competent commander. By late August and into September, Confederate forces pushed into the interior Western Virginia, and Rosecrans sallied forth to meet the enemy, first heading south toward Summersville, then to Carfax Ferry, where Rosecrans ran into a Confederate force led by John B. Floyd, a former governor of Virginia. In the mountains of Virginia, it was difficult to gather where the Confederate battle line was, so Rosecrans probed the line, attempting to find a flank or a weak point. At one point, he dismounted and helped to reform his ranks that were taking casualties. He wrote, "I saw a regiment that had retired behind a hill under fire, and there was but one company formed. I asked, 'Where is your captain?' 'I don't know.' 'Where is your lieutenant?' 'I don't know.' 'Where is your orderly sergeant?' Telling the orderly sergeant to form company, Rosecrans went to the next company. 'Where is your captain?' 'I don't know.' 'Have you a captain?' 'Yes, sir.' 'Is he here?' 'He was here.' 'Where is he now?' 'I don't know.' I found out of the 10 companies but one captain at his post." The Confederates soon withdrew from their position once Rosecrans and the other commanders restored order in the ranks. The Battle of Carfax Ferry was another great victory for Rosecrans, and both Union and Confederate newspapers were taking notice of the general operating in Western Virginia. The Department of the Ohio under Rosecrans' command was divided up when Kentucky's neutrality came to an end in September 1861. Ohio, Indiana, and parts of Kentucky within 15 miles of Cincinnati were now under the Department of the Ohio under Ormsby Mitchell, and Rosecrans would now command the Department of Western Virginia. Rosecrans, believing he had been hamstrung by the order because his supplies came from Cincinnati, and it was no longer in his department, wrote to Washington complaining of the situation. He received word that "no blow has been struck at you. That phrase objectionable. Draw reinforcements and supplies as before. You are a soldier, a scientific general, and confidence is reposed in your judgment and discretion as well as in your zeal and valor." With that situation resolved, Rosecrans pressed on to Big Sewell Mountain, but found Robert E. Lee and his forces entrenched and waiting for an attack. Rosecrans was outnumbered and decided to withdraw closer to his supply bases, as his men wore threadbare uniforms and needed reprovisioned. They camped near Gauley Bridge and awaited supplies.